We've been talking about the cycle of sin, slavery, suffering, supplication, salvation, sanctification, silence, and shalom. Right? Is this cycle, but it ends. It ended with Samson. Yeah, the cycling is over, and I'll explain a little bit about why that is. But a very brief review about last week, which was sort of the revenge of Samson. And, we get to last week and it becomes abundantly clear. Samson has truly been wronged, even though he's no pillar of righteousness himself. And his lust for foreign women has made him vulnerable to the Philistines, who kind of pull like a little bit of a gypsy move on him, taking advantage of him. So he ends up paying a bridal price for a wife he never gets. So he sets their fields on fire in a very uncomplicated way with 3,000... Yeah, a novel way, in a very novel way. He sets their fields on fire, and then he kills 1,000 of them with a donkey jawbone. But then, after a brief interlude, a weird one with a foreign prostitute, in which he escapes by his own strength, he sees Delilah, and away we go again. And he's once again hanging out in a vineyard with a foreign woman, and he lusts for Delilah. And it's really interesting. We always think of Delilah as his wife, but there's really no evidence he ever married her. And he seems to be still married, contractually at least, to the first Philistine woman. And they, of course, engage in a classic, what I wrote as a pseudo-love battle, because if you really loved me, what's the classic line? If you really loved me, then you would, thing, which gets him captured and his eyes gouged out, which, by the way, was very well fitting for the whole book, because the whole book is, and then they did what? Evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And so that theme is not accidental, that he has his eyes gouged out. And then, of course, we know how the story ends. But I thought what was the most interesting point about all of that was instead of the Jews crying out in this cycle of sin that leads to slavery and suffering and then supplication, the crying out, the Samson story is quite different. Instead of suffering under their slavery, there's the A word instead of an S word. They begin to assimilate. And that's really interesting, because we can almost garner and teach out of that moment that the assimilation into the pagan world around them was perhaps more dangerous than a suffering under slavery. Because when they suffer under slavery, they at least cry out to God for rescue, which continues to unite them as God's chosen people. But when they begin to assimilate into the culture, then we lose all definition of who God's people are. And I think to God, this becomes a more dangerous thing than an oppressive slavery, which we didn't even really make too many analogies about the Christian church in the country today, but you could kind of see. So God actually uses Samson to create confrontation with the Philistines by, for example, marrying a woman and then causing an issue and killing 30 really rich guys and stealing their linen clothes, and then killing 1,000 of them, and then calling them all donkeys. Remember that? Because he killed 1,000. And then the whole episode with Delilah, he has shamed them, and through it all, he creates a conflict that God's people in the end can be standing on their own again. So the end of the Samson story last week, we move into the introduction to tonight. The end of the Samson story, believe it or not, is the end of the story of Judges, if that makes sense, yeah? But yet we still have 5 chapters to go. But for the next 5 chapters, we don't do the cycle of S's, right? The best description I read about it is if everything else in the book of Judges was like a bird's eye view of what was going on, of the people of Israel going through the cycle, of sin, slavery, suffering, sanctification, the whole cycle, right? The next 5 chapters is going to be like a ground level view of what that sin exactly was. Because previously all we've heard is, and then the people sinned in the eyes, what does it say? They committed evil in the eyes of the Lord, but it doesn't really say much about what they were doing. Well, we're going to hear a few stories now in the next 5 chapters of exactly what they were doing, which is why, if you remember, was Tim Mackey and the Bible Project guys described it as, the arc of the people sin, God raises up good judges, and then God raises up not so good judges, and then just everything collapses into a big pile of blah at the end of the book. Well, that's where we are. Yeah. It literally, this is what Tim Mackey said, it goes from okay to not so okay to pretty bad to worse. And we have now arrived at the worst section of the book of Judges, okay? In fact, Tim Keller himself said, this next section, these next 5 chapters, which we'll either wrap up next week or the week after, he goes, they're so bleak that these passages are almost never preached upon and seldom studied. Quite honestly, I would say it's hard to find a redeeming factor, but I actually found some pretty cool stuff that I think you might find interesting. Believe it or not, if I make it sound like you're going to hate tonight's study, I actually really enjoyed studying for tonight. There was some fun stuff coming up. So it gets weird. We're going to start out kind of slow, and then we're going to pick up some big chunks as we move on. So chapter 17, verses 1 to 4. Now, a man named Micah from the hill country of Ephraim said to his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and about which I heard you utter a curse, I have that silver with me. I took it. Then the mother said, oh, the Lord bless you, my son. When he returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother, she said, I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord for my son to make a carved image and a cast idol. I will give it back to you. So he returned the silver to his mother, and she took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to a silversmith who made them into an image and the idol, and they were put in Micah's house. Well, already I titled this section, The Fruit Doesn't Fall Far from the Tree, because here we get a guy who goes, hey, you know that silver that was taken from you? Oh, by the way, it was me that took your silver. And he gives it to his mom, and his mom says, well, praise the Lord that you brought it back. I'm so happy about it that I will dedicate all this to the Lord. And then she actually dedicates 82, she keeps 82%.
Yeah. Her fee.
Yeah, her keeping fee. So most of the 2 chapters tonight revolve around this guy, Micah. He's a classic character because he's not all bad, but he's not all good either. By the way, sound like anybody you might know? Not all bad, but not all good either, yeah? If he was good, he wouldn't steal from his mom, and if he was all bad, he wouldn't return it. However, he doesn't really seem totally motivated by a guilty conscience as much as the curse that she put on him. Does that make sense? Yeah? Because it says in there, she uttered a curse on him. She, on the other hand, is not much better. She solemnly consecrates all the returned silver, except that for the 82% that she keeps for herself. Now, if you're wondering about this, the idol, the ephod, and for that matter, what's coming up, the coming priest, is interesting. And I want to just pause here for a second to give you a little better description of it. These aren't necessarily pagan idols, which is an interesting little factoid. And I went around and did some research, and I kind of agree with this. But these are graven images and idols of God, of Yahweh. But it is a breaking of the commandments given in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 4. Thou shalt not create an idol, right? Make an idol of God. Now that begs the question, well, what is wrong with graven images, even if it's of Yahweh? And one of the most interesting things I read today is the reason why is this, because an image of God can never express the whole gamut of God's character. Let me read a quote to you. Worshipping God with images reveals an inward spirit which does not want to submit to the whole God as he is, but which wants to pick and choose attributes in order to create a God who is palatable to us. So think about it. We should have no graven images of God. You might remember perhaps the first image you ever saw of Jesus of him holding a little kid on his lap when you were in Sunday school. Well, that's different than the God who sends an angel to slaughter 100,000 disobedient Israelites, right? And the point he makes there is if we create images of God, we end up sort of creating the kind of God we want. And I actually think he's really onto something when he says this, because you've heard me teach on this before, what I call the Burger King of God, right? The reason that resonates with me is because I was guiltier than perhaps most. One of the commentators said the greatest sin of our time is these words. Well, I think God, right? Or, well, I don't believe in a God who would. Think about what that's actually doing there. I found a new term for it. Did you ever guys have a daughter and you brought her to Build-A-Bear? Did you ever bring Luna to a Build-A-Bear? We don't really have a Build-A-Bear here. But I did, and you go and you pick out the bear and then they stuff the bear and then you put a secret wish and then you put it in there and then they sew that secret wish up and you build your own bear and then you buy accessories. It's a genius marketing thing because, the bear itself's only $15, but if you want to trick it out, it's another $50, And of course you have to trick it out, right? Whatever. But build a God. I know I've probably told this story. My friend Dave McVean, who found out I'd become a Christian, sent me an email and he said, well, me personally, I take a little bit from the Bible, take a little bit from Buddha, a little bit from Hindu, and a little bit of science and a little bit of common knowledge. And that's where I get my belief system. And I wrote him back, congratulations. You built your own God, like a Lego set, And then, the running joke is after you're done building your God and you sort of set it there, guess who it looks like? And it's really true. That this is how I live. So this is another great quote. I forget who said this. But when we simply ignore the parts of God we don't like, it means we don't have a God that can ever contradict our deepest desires and say no to us. We never wrestle with him. We never let him make demands on us. And we end up worshiping a much more comfortable God, but also a non-existent God. Isn't that good? Yeah, because he's just a figment of our own imagination. I thought that was really good. And so that's sort of first part of the teaching tonight. And now it's going to get worse. Verse 5. Now this man Micah had a shrine, and he had an ephod and some idols, and installed one of his sons as his priest. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. Okay, can we just pause here? Do I need to explain this to you?
Sounds like today.
Yeah, he installs his own priest. Somebody help me out here. Who is the priest supposed to be?
He made his own religion.
Right, he made his own religion. Where is the priest supposed to come from? The tribe of Levi. Okay, I know you all know that. I wanted you to hear it say it, right? Yeah. You're right. He's creating his own religion. A religion that is not about God and his truth, but about me and my ideas. Oh, I'll just sort of build a bear, my own little religion here. Yeah. By the way, it's going to get even worse in the next section, but let's just pause here for a second. For some reason, I thought of the guy in C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce who sort of comes up to hell and is met by one of his former colleagues, and the colleague's like, isn't this exciting? We're going to get to see God. And he goes, well, your definition of God. And then the guy actually tells him, I actually need to be back by tonight. And he's referring to hell. It doesn't say hell, but it infers that. He says, because I'm presenting my paper on new concepts about God. And the guy sharing with him is like, no, you don't need to. Actual God is just right beyond those clouds back there. And of course he says, no, you're so narrow-minded. Right? But in my paper that I'm about to discuss about God, and that is that idea that, in fact, he actually says, what fun would it be to actually meet a real God? We couldn't speculate anymore about him. That's what he says, yeah? But this is something even far worse going on here with Micah. He's basically like the God of Lucky Charms, right? The God that I can control and manipulate. And to prove that point, we continue in the story where it gets worse, because look what happens in verse 7. A young Levite, well, here we go, from Bethlehem in Judah, who had been living within the clan of Judah, left that town in search of some other place to stay. And on his way, he came to Micah's house in the hill country of Ephraim. Micah asked him, where are you from? I'm a Levite, from Bethlehem in Judah. And he said, I'm looking for a place to stay. And Micah said to him, live with me and be my father and priest, and I'll give you 10 shekels of silver a year, your clothes and your food. So the Levite agreed to live with him, and the young man was to him like one of his sons. Then Micah installed the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in his house. And Micah said, now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since this Levite has become my priest. By the way, at first when you read this, like if you don't know the rest of the story and the context of what's going on, for a second it actually looks kind of good, doesn't it? Like, oh, thank God. We've got an actual Levite priest. This must be a good thing, right? Instead of just having Micah's son, we have a legit Levitical priest. Well, when you see what happens, this is not a good thing at all, right? And one of the first clues we have is in the verbiage. Look what Micah says. This Levite has become my priest. By the way, just so you know, this is not the way things are supposed to work according to the book of Leviticus and Numbers and Exodus when God sets up the priest. Oh, you can have your own priest? Because guess what that means if you have your own priest, right? By the way, my thoughts on this, this is a great quote. Religion is a way to get God to serve you. Faith is to get your heart ready to serve him. Does that make sense? Yeah? So they're creating their own little religion with which they can, and you're going to see, if you think I'm exaggerating it, I'm speaking in the context of where the story is going. I always tell people, beware about books on prayer, because one summer I wanted to sort of get to the bottom of how prayer works, and I was going to teach this 10-week series on prayer at the end of the summer to my young adults. And so I read a whole bunch of books on prayer. And it's kind of dispiriting how many books on prayer at their root are basically how to get God to do what you want. Like more effective prayers, you know? And they might even sort of poo-poo it at the beginning. But then the gist of it is basically if you do this and if you do that and da-da-da-da, God pretty much has to do what you want him to do for you, yeah? It's kind of a subtle, insidious thing. But beware of any statement that says this, well, God has to bless you if you, right? Or how about this one? This one's kind of a silly one. Do you remember when the internet first came around? Well, I look around this room and all of you remember when the internet started. Remember when you first started getting emails? Do you remember the forward this to 10 people and God has to answer your prayer? And they still come around. And then the flip side on that one is, if you don't forward this email, it means you don't you're ashamed of Jesus, and then you'll suffer some curse or something. I don't know. That used to just drive me nuts. And what drove me nuts, quite honestly, and I hope I can say this okay in this crowd, was how many of my own people from my church were forwarding that garbage around. It was embarrassing. You could almost tell when somebody got email. And the first thing they did was got one of these weird chain emails, and they thought it would be really helpful to email it to everybody in the church. And of course, they got to email the pastor to show how spiritual they are. And I was like, oh. And so I would always gently send a nice email back about, hey, like this is not actually the way prayer works. Emails, God's not reading your emails and answering your prayers based on how many emails you send out, right? That's just not the way it works. So let's move the story on and talk about idolatry in the house of Dan. I almost kind of want to give it away, so I'm just going to go ahead and give it away. We're going to move from idolatry in the house of one man, and all that's really going to take place in chapter 18 is it's going to be broadened out to idolatry for an entire tribe. So Micah sort of sets the precedent for what is going to happen throughout the tribe of Dan. Does that make sense? Okay. So I kind of gave away the plot there, but you've probably all read ahead anyway. So chapter 18, verse 1. Yes? Yeah, it's a good spot to actually break. And by the way, in all humility, I will tell you, I was a couple years into my faith before I recognized that and believed it. Does that make sense? Like, I think the first maybe year to 2 years of me being a believer, even to the point where I'm up leading worship on a Sunday morning, and I'm still sort of crafting together Dain's version of God, but using the Bible as my Burger King menu. Does that make sense? like sort of still trying to fit Jesus into my concept of God. And what happened is every time I would try to sort of shape God, the Bible would sort of reject it. You know what I mean? It wouldn't fit. My version of who I wanted God to be wouldn't fit the Bible. And eventually there was sort of a tipping point, right? Of, well, then I guess I'm going to have to give up my idea of who I think God is and hear from God himself about who he is, which fits into perfectly what our understanding of Scripture is, which is the revelation of God about himself to his creation. And I know that sounds really logical in 2022 at age 58. I've been a believer 32 years from now. But that was a hard wall to hit when I was, 28, you know? That was a hard wall to hit, to go, oh no, what if I don't like the God of the Bible? Now what, right? Chapter 18, verse 1. In those days, Israel had no king, and in those days, the tribe of the Danites was still seeking a place of their own where they might settle, because they had not yet come into an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. Now, I keep referring to the Danites as the sad sack tribe, and just so you know, the proof is in tonight's teaching, because all three commentators that I read, none of them have much respect for the tribe of Dan, right? They failed to do the work that God called them to because they did not have the faith to take what God had given them. So instead of conquering the land that God said he had already conquered for them, they're sort of stuck somewhere between one tribe of Philistines and the Amorites, and they're like quite literally living like refugees in a refugee camp in a semi-nomadic existence, right? And so, remember the story of Micah? Look what they try to do, verses 2 to 6. So the Danites sent 5 warriors from Zorah and Eshtaol to spy out the land and explore it. These men represented all their clans, and they told them, go explore the land. The men entered the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah, where they spent the night. When they were near Micah's house, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. So they turned in there and asked him, who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? Why are you here? And he told them what Micah had done for him and said, he has hired me and I am his priest. There's some key words. Then they said to him, please inquire of God to learn whether our journey will be successful. And the priest answered them, oh, go in peace. The journey has the Lord's approval. Now, I wasn't the only one to speculate when I was reading the commentaries on this, but most people guesstimate that they probably paid him some bucks to sort of do an oracle type thing with the ephod, with the graven images and the pagan idols, right? But notice that key word that the priest says, oh, he hired me. We have no such thing, do we, in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy about hiring your own priest. So already the wording tells us something interesting. The wording also gets interesting because the Danites say, please inquire of Elohim. Notice they don't use the full name of God. They don't use the proper personal name of God, Yahweh. They use a name Elohim that can actually be used for any pagan god, and it's a sign of sort of disrespect. It could mean any god, any small g god, and the Levite, of course, is supposed to be speaking on behalf of not any god, but of the only God, capital Y, Yahweh. And so, from the context of this story, remember what's happening here. This is the sad sack tribe that God said, I have given you this land. Remember I told you where it is? It's where Joppa and Tel Aviv are, and maybe even all the way down to where Gaza is right now. And now they've gone the other direction. They've gone north to Ephraim, and they're asking, hey, can please inquire to learn whether our journey will be successful. Can I just ask you the question? Where do you think God would actually have them go? Back to Joppa, where they were supposed to go in the first place, but they're headed in the wrong direction. So what does that tell you about who they're actually hearing from? We know already it's not Yahweh, okay? In fact, no way. way, no way. Yahweh, no way. Anyways, that's an old joke, right? So check this out. It gets even worse. So the 5 men left and came to Laish, where they saw that the people were living in safety, like the Sidonians, unsuspecting and secure. We'll come back to that. And since their land lacked nothing, they were prosperous. Also, they lived a long way from the Sidonians and had no relationship with anyone else. And when they returned, let me see how far I was going to go. I'm going to go to verse 10. When they returned to Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers asked them, how did you find things? They answered, come on, let's attack them. We've seen that their land is very good. Aren't you going to do something? Don't hesitate to go there and take it over. When you get there, you'll find an unsuspecting peaceful people and a spacious land that God has put into your hands, a land that lacks nothing whatsoever. One of the best quotes I heard from the commentators I read was, it was as if they went back and said, we won't even need God, right? These people are so weak. Think about that. Okay, so number one, this is almost 100 miles farther north than where God actually told them to settle. I'm looking around the room, like Garrett, you guys, Levi, you've been there as well. Sherry's been there. Who else went with me? I guess that's it. If you've been to Dain, where Laish, it's a long stinking way from where they're supposed to be, right? In fact, it's really cool when you go there. They've actually excavated the entry gate to Lash, and there's a really good chance Abraham himself went through that gate. But what I want to point out to you guys tonight is, since we've been through the whole book of Judges, is how ridiculously different this is from virtually every challenge God gave the Israelites, not just in the book of Judges, but also in the book of Joshua. Normally, when God says, I want you to go take that land, the Israelites are outnumbered ridiculously. I mean, remember with Barak, it was 30 against like 30,000? Or was it 100? I forget the numbers. 300. 300,000?
No, 300 people. Are you talking about Gideon?
No, I think it was Barak. The one he said, go down and have the men drink from the whatever. Oh, it was 300 against 30,000? That was Gideon, not Barak? Okay, it was Gideon, not Barak. But it's always these insane differences. You will go up against, and they will have, 10,000 chariots. But you, my people, won't use horses and you won't use chariots. Instead, you will rely on God. And this is a story of completely the opposite. We won't even need God. We're going to go pick on these weak people. And by the way, I noticed something just interesting that I went and looked up the Hebrew. We saw that their people were unsuspecting and secure. It's translated a few different ways. One says a peaceful people or whatever. And I really found it was interesting because normally when God says, I want you to go attack these people, there's the gist of sort of they've been warned, but the time of warning is over. It's time to go take it. But the way this is worded, you get the sense they're not going with God's blessing on this, that God hasn't actually told them to take this land from these people, because it's the only tribe that they go up against that I can think of in, Joshua and Judges, where it's kind of written about them in almost a sympathetic way, isn't it? An unsuspecting and peaceful people. Look at that word unsuspecting. All through the book of Joshua, I took great pains to explain to you that God had warned all the Canaanites. In fact, even was it Wolf that said it appeared that these people were not under the Canaanite curse that all the other Canaanites were under. Isn't that interesting? I'm only pointing that out, that clearly these people are outside of the will of God. So verse 11 to let's read 11 to 17. I keep saying it gets worse. It gets worse. Then, verse 11, then 600 men from the clan of the Danites, armed for battle, set from Zorah and Eshtaol. On their way, they set up camp near Kiriath Jearim in Judah. This is why the place west of Kiriath Jearim is called Machana Dan, which means house of Dan, or Dan's camp, which is, I think you should rename Dan Bouye's house that. But anyways, Machana Dan, to this day. From there they went on to the hill country of Ephraim, and they came to Micah's house. Remember, Micah's not a Danite. Then the 5 men who had spied out the land of Laish said to their brothers, do you know that one of these houses has an ephod, other household gods, a carved image, and a cast idol? Now you know what to do. So they turned in there and went into the house of the young Levite at Micah's place and greeted him. The 600 Danites, armed for battle, stood at the entrance to the gate. And the 5 men who had spied out the land went inside, and they took the carved image, the ephod, the other household gods, and the cast idol, while the priests and the 600 armed men stood at the entrance of the gate. Now, by the way, can I just pause here for a second and point out, how's that for a list of forbidden items? I added into my notes, gee, I wonder, did they have a Ouija board, some crystals, and some books on astrology too? Like, right? Like, I can't even think of another thing they might have come up with that could be any more offensive to God. Now, by the way, just to describe something, in case you're wondering what some of these things are, the ephod was supposed to be a garment worn by who?
Priest.
Not only the priest, the high priest. And so to Luigi's earlier point, Mike has kind of pretty much formed his own religion. He's got his own high priest working for him, right? But then you add up all the other stuff. Household gods, pagan gods, the cast idol. Probably one of these was, the carved image was probably the graven image that was supposed to be Yahweh or whatever. But it gets worse. Verse 18 to 21. When these men went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, and the other household gods, and the cast idol, the priest said to them, hey, what are you doing? And they answered him, be quiet. Don't say a word. Check this out. Come with us and be our father and priest. Isn't it better that you serve a tribe and a clan in Israel as priests rather than just one man's household? Then the priest was glad. Oh, and he took the ephod and the other household gods and the carved image and went along with the people. And putting their little children, their livestock, and their possessions in front of them, they turned away and left. Is this just going from bad to worse here? Not only does the priest gladly accept the higher position, think about it. You know what's coming with this, right? More bucks, more power, and more prestige. But he doesn't even seem particularly bothered to sort of break his contract that he had with Micah, nor participate in what is really the theft of all their stuff, right? The graven images and everything. And I just got to pause here for a second and wonder if he wasn't trying to justify it with thinking like, well, think how much more ministry I'll be able to do. Now, why do I say that? Because just for fun today, I went onto YouTube and I found that clip that I've actually shown in here on a Sunday morning, which was Kenneth Copeland and what was the guy's name? Dennis something or other from Florida. As they're sitting around a table talking about why they need another jet. And mind you, they're not looking for a jet. They're raising $60 million to buy a specific jet. And so to justify it, besides the one they already have, yeah, I know, they're going to add to it. I think Copeland, this was his 3rd jet he was trying to raise money for, right? But their commentary is just, as you know, I read the comments below, it's like a Saturday Night Live skit. Like you almost can't even believe it's really happening. Because the one guy tells a story, he says, well, what happened was I was on my jet and I stood up to pray. And God said, do you only have enough faith for one jet? Have you come to the end of your faith? And he's standing there, and Kenneth Copeland cuts him off and says, I want to point out something to you right now. This is why you need a jet, because you can't do that on a commercial flight. And he goes on and he says, and that's the truth. You cannot pray on a commercial airliner. He goes, in this dope-filled world, you can't get on an aluminum jet with all those demons. And he says, an aluminum tube filled with demons, which may I just point out, he just insulted everybody in this room, right? And do God's ministry. And then it wasn't in that clip, because they cut it short. I think it's later on from that same thing, where they basically work themselves up into a frenzy where they say this: you cannot do ministry without a jet. You just cannot.
Where's your jet?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, that's why I suck at the ministry or whatever, right? But I'm just envisioning this priest for hire of Micah, right? Mike, who, how long did it look like he had to meditate and pray about whether or not to go and become a bigger shot? Look what they say, why be the priest of one small little household when you could be the priest of a nation?
Bigger congregation.
A bigger congregation, more bucks, more power, more prestige. How long did he hesitate? Not even for a split second. And that's why I wonder if he didn't sort of sell it to himself as, oh, think of the good I could do.
Thank you, Jesus.
Yeah.
Thank you, God.
Thank you, God. Anyways, isn't that it? By the way, I was going to, I send out my weekly email. I was going to send the link to that YouTube clip, but I couldn't. And the reason I couldn't was it's kind of creepy, man. Like, I don't even know if I should tell you should go watch the clip. It's kind of almost like demonic in a way. It's so like, it makes your skin crawl to watch it take place. Yeah. Anyways, there's parts of me that like I'm hesitant, as I always say, to hack and denigrate the bride of Christ. But I don't have any problem at all hacking those guys. I really don't. I will stand before God and say, yeah, I hacked them. Sorry. I think those guys are creeps.
But did he get his jet?
He got his jet. Oh yeah, he got his jet. Yeah, $60 million jet. Now he can do real ministry. He'll be his prayers will be much more effective.
30,000 as he flies way above all of us with our needs down here.
Oh, it's just we could start uncovering the dirt of what's going on there. The suckers that are, fleecing the widows of their mites, to pay for jets and stuff. You know what a jet like that costs to run a year? Oh, anyway. Okay. So let's go to back to more hideousness. Okay, verse 22. When they had gone some distance from Micah's house, the men who lived near Micah were called together and overtook the Danites. And as they shouted after them, the Danites, and you got to love this, turned and said to Micah, "What's the matter with you that you called your men out to fight?" And he replied, "You took the gods I made and my priest and went away. What else do I have? How can you ask, 'What's the matter with you?'" And the Danites answered, "Don't argue with us, or some hot-tempered men will attack you, and you and your family will lose your lives." So the Danites went their way. And Micah, seeing that they were too strong for him, turned around and he went back home. Now, the Danites are moving slow because they have their families, their women and children, the livestock moving in front of them. And I just kind of love this story. It's so human, isn't it? Like the way the Danites say, they're like, what? Like Micah's like, "Hey, you took all my stuff." And they're like, what are we doing? He's like, "You took all my stuff." And then they immediately go from that to, "I don't think you want to mess with us. You're outnumbered by quite a few." It turns threatening quickly. And Micah's kind of like left to kind of just sort of squirm there. And the word that they say, these hot-tempered men, the word actually means are bitter, but there's actually, one commentator said there's a whiff of desperate. Like, these guys are desperate men. They don't have a homeland. They've been living in a refugee camp. And they got one little dude that's like squeaking at them, "Give me my priest back." And they're like, "I think you're messing. You don't want to like fight this, yeah?" But the greater point to be made here, I actually stole from Tim Keller. And he says this, and I love this because this was me. Self-made religion will always disappoint. Whatever we make into our God, whether it be money, power, relationships, or even and I like this, a man-made version of the biblical God, it will never deliver. The world is full of stories of people who at the end of their lives were clinging to some version of meaning, the self-importance of the theologian in The Great Divorce who refuses the actual living God in favor of his important paper that he wrote about God, or the sad fate of the woman in the same book who's clinging to the self-worth of her own physical beauty, only she's not beautiful anymore. If you put your eggs in the basket of any other small g god that this world has to offer, it will always desert you in the end. It will always leave you at the end. When I read that, it reminded me of my favorite character from the Carol Burnett show. Remember Nora Desmond from Sunset Boulevard? And she always plays, Carol Burnett plays this, Harvey Korman plays her butler. And she goes out to the restaurant in Beverly Hills. And she's like this old, washed up movie star. And she's like, Max, protect me from my fans. Only nobody even knows who she is. Max, don't let them mob me. And he's always like, yes, Nora. Whatever, this and that. But I'll be flat out honest with you. I still am not convinced that I have completely killed the idol of surfing in my life. And the only reason I say that is God has gone to great lengths to separate me from surfing. 6 years to raise babies, I didn't surf, right? And then the very month I start surfing again, I surf for exactly 20 days, I counted, and I break my arm and I'm out for another 6 months. And then 6 years after that, I blow out a shoulder, I'm out for a year. And then all last year, I blew out my shoulder, I'm out for another year. 3 years in 10 years, and I'm like, have I not learned my lesson? Is this an idol that I need to worry about, God? But my point is this. Why do I tell you that? I don't really know that God really is like doing that. But my point is this. Every time I'm out of the water for a year, I'm faced with the harsh reality of what would my life be if I could never surf again? It's been sort of a part of my life for so long. And I'm always back in that same driver's seat or that same boat again of nothing in this world, right, can ever take the place of God. Because everything in this world is broken and is diseased and has a sinful nature and is weak and is disintegrating and will let you down. Your fame, your fortune, your power, your wife, your husband, your kids, your parents, your grandparents, your boss, your fellow church members, yourself are all broken. And if you worship at the feet of anything other than Yahweh, you're setting yourself up for a disaster. Peter says to Jesus, remember Jesus says to the boys, after it says, and the crowds deserted him. And Jesus turns to them and he says, are you guys going to go to it? And I love what Peter says. John chapter 6, verse 68. So Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom, where else shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. There's really nowhere else to go, right? And so let's wrap up the story. I'm going to save the last verse for last, but we'll wrap up. Verse 27. So they took what Micah had made and his priest, and they went on to Laish against a peaceful and unsuspecting people. They attacked them with the sword and burned down their city, and there was no one to rescue them because they lived a long way from Sidon, and they had no relationship with anyone else. The city was in a valley near Beth Rahab. The Danites rebuilt the city. By the way, it wasn't that smart, I don't think, to burn it down and then have to rebuild it, but whatever. Remember, God never told them to do that. Yeah, they always kept the cities. But anyways, they named it Dan after their forefather Dan, who was born to Israel, though the city used to be called Laish. There the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses and of sons, were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. So they conquer Laish. There's a couple little interesting tidbits. Note that they stole what it says, what Micah made. Have you heard of the term man-made religion? That's pretty much it right there. They stole what Micah made. So if you think of man-made religion, there's Exhibit A. And then I said that point. By the way, there was an interesting thing there that one of the guys, the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan. wait, the grandson of Moses became a pagan priest? Well, apparently that's exactly what it looks like. I didn't notice that. First I saw Tim Keller pointed it out. And this is what he said: God has no grandchildren. What does he mean by that? He says, everybody stands alone before God. And the reason I think that's funny is, you know how many times in my life when somebody has asked me what I do for a living and I say I'm a pastor and they say, oh, my uncle was a pastor. Sort of this idea that I'm kind of in with God because my dad was a pastor. I'm probably pretty good. I'm probably squared away. You know, it doesn't work that way. There's no grandchildren. Each generation stands before their own. In fact, if anything, I heard a great teaching from Tim Mackey, the Bible Project guy, the other day. I didn't think it had anything to do with this, but he said, you know how the verses God will punish generations till the fourth generation? He believes if you do a deep dive study into the Hebrew on that, what it really means is not that God is going to punish these innocent generations, because it doesn't sound like God, does it? But what he's actually saying is nobody gets a free pass because of the contract I made with you. Everybody will be under the same contract for all generations. Everybody stands alone. Don Carson said this: beware that when one generation knows the gospel, the next generation assumes the gospel, and the third generation loses the gospel. Does that make sense? Yeah? Which is why we make such a big deal around here about passing on the legacy to the next generation, raising up guys like Tony and Enns and Kyler and Jenna and Nate and Allegra and the Anchor House to make sure the generations behind us are there. And then lastly, second to last before we do the last verse, it says an interesting verse: until the time of the captivity of the land. What did you guys think of when you thought of the captivity of the land? What did you think of?
They were the first ones to go.
They were the first ones to go under the Assyrians, which is, yeah, your people, which is what I thought. But I want to submit to you, there's a couple other possibilities, because that's where I went immediately. It could be, apparently there was a time during the latter period of Judges that there might have been a border defeat at that time. And also during the time of Saul, right after the death of Saul, it said the Philistines conquered a large swath of land. It might have been that time, or it's referring to the Assyrian captivity. It really depends on what time this book was written, which I don't want to get into the chronology of the authorship of the book and when the book was written, but it kind of depends on who actually wrote the book of Judges, which we don't really know. So I don't know why I'm interested in that stuff. I hope you guys are too, because I always come up with that stuff. We don't really know, but those are the three possibilities, and it comes down to what you believe about when the book of Judges was written. However, just so you all know, to Lewis's point, this is an important teaching, because the tribe of Dan, the sad sack tribe, was the first tribe to be taken away by the Assyrians and never heard of ever again. While they were busy worshiping Baal, the Assyrians put hooks in their noses, is actually what it says, and took them off to captivity. Okay, and then the last verse is kind of a classic. It's kind of a great and a perfect ending to all of this. Verse 31. And they continued to use the idols Micah had made, and all the time the house of God was in Shiloh.
Lucky Charms.
So I don't know if you caught what was happening with that statement, but all the time they were using little Lucky Charms and rabbit's feet and creating their own little graven images. Yahweh himself was totally available at Shiloh. God had made a total way and it possible for people to approach him, to worship him, to know him, and live with him. God's presence among his people was in Shiloh at the tabernacle, and that should have been the focal point of Micah and the Danites, to go down on the Day of Atonement to worship God at the tabernacle. And so my last line for the night, what is the great takeaway from that last verse? Well, I'll take you to John chapter 1, verse 14. Remember this, tabernacle, do y'all know what the root meaning of that word is tent, right? because the tabernacle, remember, is the mobile temple. And so for 40 years, the Israelites go into the desert, well, pretty much the first week they're there, God says, I want you to build me a tent because you're going to be a mobile people and my temple is going to be mobile because I'm going to be a mobile God. And wherever you camp, you will set up my tent and I will dwell there with you, right? So think about that. Now go to this. John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. The word dwelling from the Greek means tent. Like the literal translation of that verse is the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, right? So what is the teaching on that? We are camping with God. We have God. We don't need to go to this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing. We possess Jesus. He has made his dwelling with us. And that is what our focus is upon. And we don't need to have 10 successful strategies for a more effective prayer to get God to do things for you. Or we don't need to forward emails to 10 different people or make bargains with God like our brother and make deals. We simply worship at his feet and are obedient to him, the capital O word, which is perhaps the hardest thing to actually do. All right, we finished actually 5 minutes early on that, so if anybody has any questions or comments, we can go. Wasn't that kind of cool in the end? I thought that was kind of an interesting teaching at the end. When I first read it, it just looked like one big giant disaster, but I thought there was kind of some interesting stuff in there and some actual sort of applications to the world we live in. And the religion we practice, so to speak, as 21st century evangelical Christians, to be leery and wary of deviations away from the truths God has given us, yeah?
You know what I noticed? Well, we've gone there, and it said earlier that the land lacks nothing in Laish. It was really nice. And I remember when we went there, it was killer. Like there was trout streams.
I know, it was really beautiful, wasn't it?
Trees.
I know, it was.
It was really nice. Like back in Joppa, and where Dan was supposed to be, was
kind of desert. It was kind of desert.
But this part of it is, it was nice. It had all this. It was cool water and fruit trees.
You know what the theological takeaway from that is, though?
What?
They were seeing with worldly eyes, because where would they have been much more blessed if they had taken the land that God had given them? It would have gone well for them, and they probably wouldn't have been the first tribe to get taken away by the Assyrians. Yeah.
I mean,
so it's actually a really good illustration. You know, Eve saw the apple and what it looked. Right? It looked good. What is it? Tasty and nutritious? I forget the words.
Well, it looked good to me, you know?
Yeah.
To you.
Right, yeah.
To us.
Abraham tells Lot, you go ahead and pick the land. And it says he saw what looked good, and so he went and took what was there. And then God says to Abraham, let me show you what I will give you. So Lot makes his decision based on what he sees with his sort of worldly eyes. But Abraham, God says, I will show you what I have for you. So the teaching is, I will show you with spiritual eyes, and I will give you all of this land. And then whatever it became of Lot. Versus Abraham, right? Yeah, the blessing of abundance. But that's a good point, yeah. It was beautiful up there, yeah. Dain was a really nice hike. All right, we're out of time because I try to wrap up no later than 8:33, and here we are. Father God, thank you for your word, Lord, and thank you for even giving us some applicational lessons out of a pretty bizarre story, Lord. May we always be cognitive and aware of the things in this life, Lord, that we turn into idols, even if they're just small idols, God. May you sort them out of our lives and remove them so that our faith and our trust and our sense of purpose and meaning comes from you and only you. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.